Somehow, someway, Tony Ferguson still has a contract with the UFC and is still being booked to have fights. I mean, how did we really get here? Tony Ferguson, once touted as the scariest boogeyman in the UFC lightweight division, if not the boogeyman of the UFC, period. I mean, the lightweight division is one of the most stacked divisions and is currently the hardest division to crack through the top 15 rankings. It has been that way for a while, going back and forth with the bantamweight division. So if a fighter is a boogeyman of such a division, there is no pushback in saying that fighter would be the scariest fighter in the UFC, which is what Tony once was. His nickname is also El Cucuy, which is a perfect name for such a savage. Tony Ferguson started his UFC career in a brutal manner, which is absolutely fitting, knocking out Ramsey and Jem in the finale of The Ultimate Fighter 13, then have two more good wins before getting stopped by Michael Johnson in 2012. Since 2013, Tony will go on a really impressive 12-fight win streak full of scary submissions, knockouts, TKOs, and doctor stoppages. He created an aura of making his fights bloody and scary, regardless of if it was going the distance or not. And he absolutely had a fight style that matched perfectly with his nickname, El Cucuy. Tony managed to actually win the lightweight interim belt against Kevin Lee at some point, the ultimate match that was meant to happen, which the fans absolutely wanted, was Tony Ferguson versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. Unfortunately, the back and forth battle between Ferguson and Nurmagomedov from 2015 all the way to 2020 shines as a genuinely legendary saga with an outstanding 5 cancelled bouts. It appeared as though destiny itself was determined to keep them apart, leading to Tony facing Justin Gaethje on a short notice fight in 2020, and this was the beginning of the downfall. The fight between Tony Ferguson and Justin Gaethje was a brutal match to watch. Justin had a one-sided dominant performance, landing the most brutal strikes on Tony throughout the fight. He absolutely shut Tony down, leading to round 5, where Tony got his face punched in so much he would start shaking his head like he couldn't see. The ref eventually stepped in to stop the fight, as at that point it was just an assault. I am willing to bet Tony got some brain damage from that fight and no doubt left a piece of himself in the octagon that night. Tony would try to quickly make up for his loss by going against Charles Oliveira that same year. It was yet another tragedy, as even though the fight ended by Charles winning by a unanimous decision, Charles would get Tony in such a dangerous armbar which anyone would have tapped to. But Tony just refused to tap and was saved by the bell. He definitely got really damaged in that submission attempt and once again left a piece of himself in the octagon. Tony would then face Beneil Dariush and get caught in an absolute brutal leg lock, which again he refused to tap to. Even though he was in excruciating pain, his face and body language said so, but he just didn't tap. Beneil himself said he was sure something snapped. Tony would go around limping in the octagon after the fight, making sure everybody knew he would once again leave a piece of himself in the octagon. And of course, he would lose again in that fight. Tony would then go ahead and face Michael Chandler, and even though he won the first round, just when fans thought he was back, he would get brutally knocked out in the second round with one of the coldest, most savage head kicks, landing beneath Tony's chin and knocking him out cold, leaving a big piece of himself once again in the octagon. Tony would then have a veteran matchup against Nate Diaz. It was such a weird fight to watch, but he would end up losing by submission, finally tapping, losing to Nate Diaz. He did kind of have a lot of respect for Nate Diaz, maybe that's why he tapped, but again, it was a bad loss. Following up to another veteran matchup against Bobby Green, Bobby would end up choking Tony out, and Tony once again refusing to tap, lost control of his body and started flapping like a fish until he passed out, absolutely leaving another piece of himself in the octagon. Tony would then face Paddy Pimblett, where he lost by a unanimous decision. Tony Ferguson has been on a 7-fight losing streak, which is absolutely unprecedented in the whole of combat sports. He has lost his face, his arm, his leg, his neck, his head in the octagon. But somehow he keeps going. Somehow he hasn't been let go by the UFC because he is still such a massive fan favorite and loved by the UFC as well. The UFC has favored Tony by giving him matchups where one could argue that each fighter is less dangerous than the previous fighter he faced, but yet, for the most part, the story ends the same way. He is still having his weird unorthodox training regimen, even though they are not translating to his fight style. With a record of 26 wins and 10 losses, 7 losses in a row, Tony is still an absolute savage, but that leads to him being just too tough for his own good and not knowing when to call it quits. Tony at this time is now seen as a stepping stone gatekeeperish type fighter, which is such a disappointing downgrade from what he once was. Tony Ferguson is set to face Michael Chiesa at UFC Fight Night Abu Dhabi, and unfortunately, I fear it will be the same story all over again. Chiesa himself is on a 3-fight winning streak, but he is still a very good fighter, and we'll be looking forward to make this fight a redemption arc, putting him back in the win column. Tony will have the same goal as well, but after a 7-fight losing streak, I fear it may not even matter if he wins or not. If Tony Ferguson defeats Michael Chiesa, it will absolutely be the best and the most feel-good moment in MMA. Even better than when Dominic Reyes beat Justin Jacoby after his losing streak. And we all know Tony would then talk about making his title run, because he's already talking about a title run even though he is on a losing streak. But regardless of what the result is, I feel, in my opinion, it may just be time to hang it up. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Is this the saddest downfall in UFC history? Is it somehow possible for Tony Ferguson to rise up and come back and do something legendary again? Do you think he just needs one more win and then he goes ahead to retire, but he's just trying to make one more win? That might be a case as well. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you guys later.